This session will be titled the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, a legal primer in cross-sector regulation of infrastructures. It will be presented by Charlotte Ducuing, PhD Fellow Researcher at the Center for IT and IP Law in the University of Leuven. Charlotte got the award for the best paper last year, and we have another very good paper from her, so I'm looking forward to her presentation. So please, Charlotte, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I'll try to be on time, and my voice is a bit broken, so I hope I can make it until the end. Okay, so my paper is about the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, as it is known, a legal primer in cross-sector regulation of infrastructures. Well, we see now a convergence of networks, as a matter of fact, after network industries have developed in silos and were regulated in silos, especially with the liberalization process. In this context, the Directive 2014/61, known as the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, is interesting because it is in the EU legal order the first main piece for cross-sector regulation. Surprisingly, little attention has been paid to this directive in the scholarship. Here, I'm looking into the flagship provision of this directive, which is to provide telecom network operators with a right of access to the passive elements of the physical infrastructure, not only to other telecom network operators, but also to network operators in other sectors, in other network industries, such as in mobility or in energy. The purpose is to deploy high-speed broadband networks, such as 5G, based on the idea that the passive elements of the infrastructure are indifferentiated elements. So using them, accessing them would enable to lower the cost of rollouts of new telecom networks. This is also based on another aim, which is to foster cross-sectoral synergies, given the new case studies that we have with smart mobility, smart grids. So here on the picture is obviously an example of smart mobility. So the research questions that I want to answer here are the two following ones. So first, what type of cross-sector regulation is brought by the BCR Directive? Here, cross-sector regulation that I refer to means very broadly a type of regulation where several sectors that are traditionally subject to specific regulation are brought together, irrespective of the mode of interaction between them. Especially, I do not assume that sectors or sectoral regulations would be placed on an equal footing. Next part of my question. And the second question is, what are the factors influencing the balance or imbalance between sectors and sectoral regulations? In order to do this, I will go quickly through the flagship provisions of the BCR Directive that I quickly mentioned. These provisions constitute some sort of ridgeline between continuation and disruption of sectoral regulations. And then with the two remaining parts, I will look into the types of cross-sector regulation that the directive brings about, both on substantive level and institutional level by looking at the enforcement authority. So the directive, the directive provides network operators with a right of access to the passive elements of the infrastructure of network operators, but also of telecom network operators, but also of network operators of other sectors, as I already said. The access providers are therefore the network operators. So the directive not only provides network operators with a right to negotiate such access, but also and mainly with an obligation to provide access to their infrastructure on the fair and reasonable terms and conditions, including fair price. Then comes a non-existent list of exceptions that I'm not looking at now. We also have instrumental transparency obligations concerning this physical infrastructure. And the directive makes it compulsory for member states to set up a DSB, so dispute settlement body, that shall be legally and functionally independent from all network operators, and that should have the competence to issue binding decisions to resolve disputes, including with respect to the terms and conditions for access, and including with respect to the price, that I will discuss further later. Of course, with a time span, so maximum 4 months or 2 months for the decision to be issued. These provisions can be viewed as both a continuation and a disruption of sectoral regulations as we know it in network industries. Of course, we have a déjà vu feeling when we look at those provisions, and we know about liberalization law that are based on transparency, obligations to grant access to the infrastructure under friend conditions. All this seems very familiar. Also, the purpose to create new markets, in this case, cross-sector markets, is also something we know from liberalization law that I call here. I refer to it as the Sleeping Beauty rationale. So the idea that with those new markets opening, we have new opportunities, new growth that is there to be, that is there to flourish. The ARCEP, so the French NRA, regulatory authority in the telecom sector, considered that the BCR directive was an illustration of how good and how great symmetric regulation is. What does it mean, symmetric regulation? This is something we know from telecom law, where we have both symmetric and asymmetric regulation. So both start with the essential facility doctrine, the idea that some assets are non-duplicable or hardly duplicable, so that there should be some legal obligation to provide access. Asymmetric obligations are ex ante obligation, for instance, to provide access to the infrastructure, that are imposed by the regulatory authorities on SMP companies. In contrast, symmetric obligations fall on all operators, so irrespective of their market power, vis-à-vis each other. So there is an element of reciprocity, which we have, for instance, for interconnection obligations. In my opinion, the BCR directive is not an illustration of symmetric regulation, because there's precisely not this element of reciprocity, at least when it's cross-sector. So when telecom operators have a right to access the physical infrastructure of networks of other sectors. This being said, by transposing the directive, some member states did include a reciprocity principle. It is especially the case in Germany, Luxembourg, and Denmark. So in this case, for instance, a railway network operators will have a right of access to the passive infrastructure of telecom operators. So for obviously other purposes than deploying 5G or high-speed broadband networks. So what seems to single out the directive as opposed to traditional, so to say, liberalization law, is that here the purpose is not directly competition. Competition is just a means to an end. The end is obviously an innovation one, sorry, namely the deployment of high-speed broadband networks. We know that the European Commission and the European Union have been criticized for placing competition over investment in new networks in telecom. And obviously in the EU legal order, there is much more legal provisions for competition and internal market than for industrial policy purposes. So my opinion is that the European Commission and the EU more generally actually use the regulatory measures at its disposal for industrial policy purposes. This being said, this is not entirely new. We know that in liberalization law, the purpose was not only to have competition as if it were to be something politically neutral. There was also, liberalization law stemmed mainly from EU law, and there was also a purpose of Europeanizing utilities. So this being said, now I want to look into how the directive and the system around the directive tries to find a balance between the sectors. So the directive claims to aim towards cross-sector coordination, which seem to point to sectors being placed on an equal footing. The ARCEP, again, the French NRA, as well as Kitsos and Maniatis, consider that the directive is an illustration of interregulation, translated from French, interrégulation. This term was coined by Frison Roche in 2005, and by interregulation, she means a process to connect autonomous regulations whilst no process is in place to establish priorities between them, but eventually a decision is made. According to her, this is needed where sectoral regulations get actually overrun by increasing multi-sectoral reality. In my view, it's not the case of the directive here. It's rather the directive itself, so a regulatory attempt to create convergence, while reality actually is not as convergent as the regulator would like it to be. First reason. Second reason is that there is an obvious priority that is given to telecom network operators, and obviously the purpose is as I said, is a policy one to deploy new network. This being said, there have been attempts to foster cross-sectoral synergies to the benefit also of network operators. So I mentioned the principle of reciprocity that has been implemented in a few member states. And another example that I'd like to give is this of price setting mechanisms. So in the directive, the price is not regulated in a detailed manner. So the price has to be fair, and then it's up to market operators to negotiate the price. And it's only in case they fail to do so that the DSB should be entitled to set the price. According to the Commission in its explanatory memorandum, this was deliberate. So this flexibility, this business-friendly measure was aimed to protect network operators from the adverse effects that the directive could have to their right to property and their right to conduct a business. So it was supposed to be a middle ground between mere incentives and authoritarian price setting by law. But we know that the price is at the crossroads between many objectives. Of course, network operators would like the price to be as high as can be, while on the other way around, telecom network operators may want a lower price. And even more than that, they want clarity as for the price because they need to be able to plan the investment. There's been a growing consensus over the idea that there should be clarity on the price. Even the European Commission in its report on the implementation of the directive considers that there should be regulatory certainty, which seems quite at odds with its claim in the explanatory memorandum. Eventually, what happens now is that I'm not going into the details of...
please, 1 minute.
Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah, I don't time. What we see now is that the DSBs are required to adopt soft or hard law mechanisms to frame the price more, to give more clarity, or even some countries implemented regulatory, I wouldn't say setting of the price, but at least framing, for instance, by framing the methodology for the price. So what is the conclusion of this? Well, the conclusion is that the criteria for setting the price were deliberately kept vague in the directive so that network operators would retain some commercial flexibility. But both the transposition and the role of DSBs have often amounted to some sort of ex-ante regulatory price setting due to competing objectives. And obviously the objective of telecom sector has been superseding. So last point, I wanted to look into the institutional framework. So we know it's quite obvious that the DSB has been created following the model of sectoral regulatory authorities. So why do we want regulatory authorities, especially sectoral ones? Because we want expertise, because we want swiftness of decisions, and it's based on regulatory objectives that are specific, for instance, specific to a sector. In order to get this, the usual bundle that we have is expert staff, comprehensive competence over a given scope, meaning competencies that judiciary authorities wouldn't have, such as regulatory ex-ante powers, for instance, but also, on the flip side, a strict delineation of the jurisdiction, for instance, to a given sector. So the reason why Frison Roche referred to regulatory authorities as powerful cyclops. So against this background, is the DSB fit for cross-sector regulation? We know it's not easy for the BCR Directive and for the DSB because obviously we already have sectoral authorities, so we have a myriad of them, and it's difficult to gain expertise from all sectors. So the first question that arises is who to appoint as a DSB. So it's been mostly NRAs, so telecom regulatory authorities, But the growing model is that you should have cross-sectoral coordination between sectoral regulatory authorities, although there is nothing on that in the directive itself. So it really depends on national law. We have a great variety of modalities. Unfortunately, we don't have a comparative and comprehensive analysis or data on how it works at national level, what are the roles of the DSBs, how they interact with sectoral regulatory authorities. So my research is based on the study that was conducted for the European Commission on the implementation of the directive, as well as on the French transposition. What I found out in short is that the deadlines are very often exceeded because of the time needed for coordination between regulatory authorities, really no surprise. And because also of the need for expertise in all the sectors at stake, especially for price setting. And I think this is one of the reasons why there was this willingness to have some clarity on price setting before a case arises, because it takes so much time to go into all the elements for setting the price. We've had also a few jurisdictional issues, which seem a bit more incidental, especially in Spain. There was the issue that in order to look at municipal infrastructure, you needed also to look at local taxes, for which the DSB had no jurisdiction. And there is also a sort of sectoral bias of regulatory authorities in the sense that they would tend to favor, they seem to tend to favor their sector, which I link to the fact that they have a sectoral objective. This is their constitution in a way. So to conclude, well, it's early to conclude because we don't have that much element so far. We don't have comprehensive information on how it works at EU, throughout the EU, which would be very useful. But we see the growing model is this of a network DSB that is a solution to the cross-sectoral problems, but there are remaining challenges. So the main conclusions of the research is obviously that cross-sectoral interactions between regulatory authorities are far, far from new with the directive. We've seen this from the very beginning of sectoral regulatory authorities, and even more so. Now we have a growing number of regulatory authorities for all kinds of things. So obviously there might be growing issues and interfaces between regulations and regulatory authorities. So the directive is only part of this growing trend. I completely agree with the finding of Frison Roche that the issue is this of the lack of prioritization. So we see this, for instance, with competition and data protection law that now collide. I don't see this with the BCR Directive because it's clear that the deployment of high-speed broadband network as a sectoral industrial objective is a superseding objective. What is also relevant with the directive is that the directive brings sectors closer together rather than the other way around, that reality would become de facto cross-sectoral. Yes, this I said just for the sake of being complete. I place it here on the slide. I think it would be very important to have comprehensive information on the establishment of DSBs as well as on their practice, especially now that the European Commission announced that they would like to revise the directive, or that it at least considers a revision of the directive. So this is it for me. Okay, thank you very much. Well, going to the discussion of the paper, I think it's, first of all, it's a very good topic for conference. We will see most of the contributions to the conference, most of the papers relate to kind of convergence across industries and in regulation, that we could say somehow that they are far away in time, or they are starting to happen, but not very mature at this stage. While on the contrary, this paper focuses on an existing reality, a very specific piece of legislation that starts to deal with all the network industries together. So I think it's a very good topic for the conference. And I also think that the analysis you do around the piece of legislation is very mature. We have seen also last year in the paper you presented, I think you are very good at identifying the narratives around the pieces of legislation and identifying what are the reasoning, what is the
the cost for a specific piece of legislation. And I think you are very good at identifying and also analyzing what is the real scope of the different legislations that we are analyzing. So I think the first element, I mean, you're identified, I think, very well that all this European Union legislation on network industries is mostly about liberalization, but liberalization is not an end in itself, but it's very closely connected to what I like your experience in the Europeanization of network industries. So it's mostly about the internal market and building European areas, spaces around the different network industries. And I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind. I think you are also very good at identifying the underlying scope of telecommunications law, and so you identify the symmetric, asymmetric, ex ante, and you identify the main lines of intervention in telecoms legislation. And then third element, I think you're very good at identifying also the balance of the different interests around this very specific piece of legislation. But at the same time, I have to say that even if you identify at the beginning of the paper, you identify very well this narrative or this historic analysis of the reason for the adoption of the EU framework on telecoms and this specific directive. When you try to, I think you try a little bit to oversimplify and oppose a very binary decision around whether it's competition or industrial policy. And I think this is good in terms of making your arguments powerful. But sometimes, again, I think it's an oversimplification. And let me pose some examples to you. You try to identify that, well, all this regulation is not about the traditional ex-ante access regulation, which is imposed on operators with market power. So we have, and you identify it very rarely, we have an essential facility doctrine in competition law, and then we have the directives that somehow are advancing the line of intervention, and they impose access obligations on operators with market power. And this is one of the main elements in all the EU framework on telecoms. But then really into the EU framework, you have another couple of elements that are very close to this competition approach, or at least to the promotion of competition. First of all, it's a very standard analysis, and it was analysis also made in telecoms legislation, that you have to identify the barriers to entry to a market. And you identify, you can go through the legislation and then you can identify all the issues, I don't know, number portability, all kinds of issues which are not strictly speaking departing from essential facilities, but rather to a wider approach to how to create a market out from a pre-existing situation where such market did not exist. So the essential facility doctrine is an important element, but I don't think it's the only one. I think you overstretch this essential facility doctrine. And around the introduction of competition, you have other elements that are also necessary, but are not departing from the essential facility doctrine. I was referring to number of portability, but then you have a number of issues which are related somehow to access, and then you identify them in your paper when you are talking about the symmetric obligations on interconnection, but there are also symmetric obligations in many countries, for instance, around vertical installations in buildings, for instance, which are symmetric in many countries, and that's something that is getting more and more relevant lately. So you can see that there are elements about market entry in the old directives which are not directly related to the essential facility doctrine. So it's not related necessarily to market power, and it's just related to how to eliminate barriers to entry. And this is very closely related to the politics on the creation of a market and then the creation of a single European market. And this is not necessarily linked to industrial policy. And this is very closely linked just to the traditional policy on how to eliminate barriers to entry to create a market. Then I think there is another element which doesn't quite fit into this binary approach about whether it's competition or it's industrial policy. And it is the fact that this access to infrastructure, and I think you're very good on the differentiation between what is infrastructure and what is a network. I mean, what is the underlying physical assets to build a network upon them? And I think there is a very sector-specific element to the expansion of the access obligations, not only inside the industry, but also to other infrastructures. And I have to refer to the success in the regulation, both in Spain and Portugal, in the regulation of access to these underlying infrastructures as a success, explaining the development of fiber deployment, both in Spain and Portugal, which are the European countries probably right now with more fiber on the ground. And the reason is that in both countries there were very good underlying infrastructure, ducts, etc. And both regulatory authorities imposed access to this underlying civil infrastructure. And again, this is one of the reasons of the success in the deployment of fiber in both countries. And I think that the Commission was trying to expand this principle from purely the telecoms market to other markets. So it's something very sector specific. I think it's pretty much in line with the policy in the directives from the beginning, from the late 80s, and not so much a purely new industrial policy completely detached from competition or from the creation of a competitive market, even if it's completely detached, and that's right, from the competition law essentials facility doctrine. So I would say that that's my main point. Always this binary approach is very clear, but maybe things should not be oversimplified. Then I think you are very good at the description of the implementation and the problems, and I think you are very good at raising the institutional issues. And the more we see these cross-sectoral convergences, coupling, we will have more and more institutional problems. I think you were good at describing how in most countries at the end, it's the telecoms regulator who is taking the lead. And maybe it's not so much about convergence, but about taking the lead and telecoms to facilitate the deployment of networks. I think you are very good at identifying this. There is an issue also around this, what are the conditions for access? And I wonder whether we will have critical mass and a large number of decisions building some kind of principles to be applied for the future. And then one final comment. I think it's very interesting also this I don't know if this is really an example of convergence or coupling, or maybe just, as you were referring, a case of an interface between the different network industries, a case in which the different industries come together for something very specific. But at the same time, I think, and I like maybe a couple of words about it, I think it's very relevant in terms of the future of the digitalization of infrastructures. And at the end, this is a very big issue. I mean, all the different infrastructures need to be digitalized. And then, of course, you need some kind of telecom connectivity for these infrastructures. So this is where we could find the reciprocity. I mean, the first stage was not really reciprocal. It was more about telecoms using the infrastructure of other industries. But in the future, we might see more and more that we need to digitalize these infrastructures. And the more telecom infrastructure is running through the traditional infrastructures, the easier it will be for these other infrastructures to be digitalized. So these are my comments. I have one question, maybe very fast. Yeah, it's precisely of this reference to this, what it's called this regulation in Spain about access to civil infrastructure. There is a regulated offer called Marco, and yeah, I mean it's more like yeah, they are asking how does this SMP regulation, so the more competition law approach, cope with this new directive. And I think this is an issue you can cover. Maybe you can devote a couple of words to it. So please, Fanny, you have 5 minutes to answer to the comments and also to this question raised by João Gonçalves.
I was thinking if it is really so that this convergence of network industries results also in new forms of competition on one side on the service markets, but also on the infrastructure markets, because applications may become more substitutions in a way that when you look at, for example, at the transportation markets, you can better bypass one infrastructure and go to another infrastructure like road or rail. Then my question is, what is the role of deregulation of infrastructures, which were in earlier times essential facilities, but now can be bypassed by intermodal activities? And how can that influence the future role of markets in the infrastructures, and also give a drive in the direction of deregulation of the traditional infrastructure?
Thank you very much for the very useful comments and questions. Well, thank you for the comment on the oversimplification of the competition versus industrial policy objectives. My point was indeed not to overemphasize the essential facility doctrine as ground on which both symmetric and asymmetric regulation would be based. Probably my pen did not reflect my brain, but I completely agree. And maybe it was for the sake of moving on to the next topics, but I entirely agree. Precisely my point was that it's obviously always linked, both in the directive in this case, but also in previous regulations that we know from sectoral regulation of network industry. So it was really the other way around. My point with the directive, the reason why I wanted to emphasize the industrial policy objective was that I find it interesting here, like in other regulatory pieces, but I found it interesting that the EU, in a way, finds its way through the regulatory measures that are at its disposal in order to foster industrial policy aims, especially because we know that in telecom, there's been heavy debate on whether the EU is going the right direction for investment in new networks. So this I find from really the regulatory perspective quite interesting. Then on the sector-specific aspect, I completely agree, and I know that it's not only Spain and Portugal, but also France that had experience in similar right of access to civil infrastructure. And it seems, if I look at the report that was conducted for the European Commission on the implementation of the directive, it seems that generally the countries that had such provisions before the directive are more successful because they had history. They are more, both the operators and also the regulatory authorities are more used to dealing with cross-sector obligations of access to passive elements of the infrastructure. So it's also probably why we need more time to see the effects of the directive, especially on countries that are not so used to it. I also value very much the opening for future research on, well, the fact that indeed many infrastructure are digitizing, and so they need more telecom connectivity, and this obviously raises a number of questions. Well, I can say from my previous life as in-house lawyer in the railways that actually before we spoke about digital, there was also a great, some sort of in-house convergence of networks. In the railways, there's always been connectivity, there's always been telecom networks such as for the GSMR and everything. And it's based on such experience that the European Commission made its benchmark on what could be food for future, what turned into the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. So this is not something completely new. What I think is new is that now it's turned into a market. It used to be that there was some sort of in-house provision of connectivity or telecom services to oneself, actually. Professor Knips, thank you very much for your question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. It's a very broad and interesting question. I don't know exactly what is the role of deregulation of infrastructure. From my study on the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive and from the implementation of the directive, what I found very interesting and that could give rise to, I guess, future research is the fact that now we are confronted with competition issues on these new emerging markets, cross-sector markets, where network operators are providing access to telecom operators, So we have new competition issues, and I think it will deserve further research. But unfortunately, I don't have the answers now. Maybe we have the chance to work on that next year, or depending on the agenda of FSR.